All right. So we want to thank you all for joining us today to talk about this topic of Black love. Although I am the one introducing the topic today, I have to give complete and full credit to Dr. Searles and Professor Freeman, who I think you both of you brought this idea up way back in November, that we could have an event that married Valentine's Day with Black History slash Black Futures Month. Um, so we spent a good deal of time having conversations around this subject. Today we're going to think about it from multiple angles. And usually when we start these seminars, we sort of begin by talking about our ideas and then inviting y'all to join into the discussion. But we thought today would be a very good idea with a topic this broad, with so many different ways to come at it, to start with some audience engagement. So in just a second, I'm going to put up the Teams whiteboard, which everyone who's in the meeting should. And we're going to start with a broad question. As soon as this loads. And the broad question, if you can see it on your screen, can you see that? If I get a head nod, yes. Okay, awesome. I see a hand up. I think that's a good thing. um, the question is, what does love feel like? Um, you'll notice that there are little sticky notes on the whiteboard, and you can go ahead and create your own note, or you can hit one of these colored boxes and the pencil icon, which allows you to edit text. But we like anyone who is in the chat right now to just go ahead and write out some ideas. Share with us what you think love feels like. We're going to give you about a minute and a half or 2 minutes to sort of type out your ideas.
Joey. Hold on. Which one? That one? No, put it away.
I'm seeing some really touching responses so far. I see heartwarming, love feels free, content, and warm, safety, comfort, sacrifice, complete trust and vulnerability with another person, being 100% yourself, like this sense of authenticity. Love is the pouring out of love forever and forever. I also see someone add it into the formal chat, the word acceptance. See some new things populating, light, sacred, fulfilling. Love feels like a hug, the safest place imaginable. Someone added in the chat, appreciate it. While the remainder of these comments begin to fill in on the whiteboard, if anyone is willing to, we welcome you to raise your hand or unmute your microphone if you might want to elaborate a bit more on what love feels like. I see Jordan's hand is up.
Hey, y'all. I was actually talking to Dr. Searles about this earlier, like a few days ago, right? Because I've been reading, inspired by this, these sort of meetings we've been having. I've been trying to go back through this large, I don't know if you can call it a canon, but this collection of, Black feminist work and trying to think about, this Black feminist call to a kind of Black being, kind of loving of oneself, a self-care. And so for me, love is this kind of condition of listening. It's this willingness to listen to another person and to be heard and to hear, but at the same time to offer, a kind of correctiveness, a kind of a lovingness that is very kind and mild, but understands another person, right? So this is a little poetic, but to put in terms, I guess, a bit more practical, it's this idea that love is always bearing of relation. It's this constant calling each other to be in togetherness. It's this call of the pastor to the to the I was gonna say the communion, but the community, right? It's this call to always be involved with each other, when it comes to Black love, I think it's that call to be in relation, even in our difference and our different considerations of Blackness. It's this call to be a part of this thing that we call Blackness. But yeah, that's all I got.
Yeah, that was beautifully said, and I think you're anticipating the next question we're going to ask. But before we get there, there are some additional comments in the chat. I see love feels safe, warm, and reassuring. Love is the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. Um, and so Cynthia added as a comment to that quote, I see it as more than a quote unquote feeling. Um, and then we have a comment from Sarah, one characteristic of love is an unconditional acceptance. Are there any additional elaborations anyone would like to make? Again, you can feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself. Okay. If not, we will go on to the second question, which in some ways, as we were thinking about it, we thought it's a more particular question, but I would argue it is a very general question as well, perhaps even more general than the what does love feel like? So I'm going to move this question over and add an additional set of notes grid. And if this looks a little weird on your screen, I apologize. You may just need to scroll around a little bit. But the second question was, what comes to mind when you hear the term Black love? And again, you should be able to click on the boxes in this matrix and use the edit pencil symbol to write anything you would like to, or you can add your own additional notes to the screen. But we'll give you, again, another minute or so. What comes to mind when you hear the term Black love? First comment came in strong, loud, and proud with 3 exclamation points. We love to see it. I love this one. Miss Lauren Hill comes to mind. Let's see, family oriented, something that can only be understood within the culture. Another celebration of heartwarming lives and culture. Dr. Searles, were there also comments in the chat? I saw something pop up on my screen.
Yep, I'll read it. So, Dr. Horch Freeman says Black love is the celebration of romantic love and joy between Black people. And then Dr. Patterson says, I was just listening to Malcolm X, The Ballad or the Bullet on NPR. So in my mind, Black love is about Black empowerment. Absolutely. I love that speech.
And a very interesting, thing to think about in the context of Black love. The speech, the ballad, and the bullet, which I don't think often gets associated with a form of love. But that's something I think we'll get into today as well. Would anyone like to come off of mute and elaborate on anything that they've written on the whiteboard or express any additional thoughts? Okay. So, with those ideas in mind, right, this idea of love being something that's affirming, something that's authentic, something that allows you to be your full self, a place of warmth, comfort, security, with those ideas of love in mind, coupled with what we saw with this notion of Black love, which seems to be oriented in a less fantastical way to the grounded experiences of Black people, something that is defined within culture, something that is defined in concrete relationships between Black people. We want to explore and question and critique and revel in the joy that is this thing that we call Black love. And if you saw the flyer we sent out, you'll notice that we had Black love in 3 different permutations. The first one was Black love without any parentheticals. And we thought about this as a cohort, as a term that may describe the varied ways that Black people love each other, whether that love is familial, between friends, whether it's erotic or sensual, whether it's monogamous, polyamorous, heterosexual, or queer. Love shows up between Black people in a variety of ways. But we also thought about this second permutation, or right, Black being a modifier. So what does it mean when the concept of love is encumbered by the history of Blackness, something that we've been thinking about a lot over the course of these Reimagining Blackness seminars? What does it mean? How are we able to think about or narrate the concept of love when we think about it in the context of Black history? And then finally, what does Black become, or what can it become if it is modified by this thing that we call love? So in these 3 different iterations, the 3 of us in the cohort are going to take some stabs at either defining these terms or completely unsettling our definitions of these terms. So first we're going to have Dr. Freeman, or Professor Freeman, who is going to lead us on Black love in the first iteration, and then I'll talk about Black love when love is modified by Blackness, and then Dr. Searles will finish up by talking about Blackness when modified by love. So, Dr. Freeman, I will turn it over to you.
I'll take the Dr. Freeman. It's Professor Freeman.
I keep doing that, but I honor you as doctor. Honorary doctorate for you.
I'll take it. So first of all, I don't usually write poetry, and I'm a visual artist, but I did write something for this one, so I'm going to start with that. So Black love. She loves me in spite of my Black body. No. She loves me although my skin is as black as a kettle. No. She loves me because my skin is pitch black. She loves me, and she loves that my skin is pitch black. She loves my Blackness, my nose, my lips, my words, my resistance, my swagger, my awkwardness, our oneness, and our history. I love her Black love. When someone says that love is blind, they are often asserting that physical features are not important to the conversation. At other times, it is used to describe the ability to overlook someone else's faults. But we also know that who we love is not coincidental. Social conditioning, status, appearance, and of course, race, skin color, and cultural differences play a major role in who we choose and who we allow ourselves to love. I don't know that I can say love is blind, but I also don't know that love should be blind. I'd rather be seen. One of the things that came out of our early discussions is that we need to establish common ground through defining the terms that we're using, because we often use the same words to talk about different things. What does it mean to say, what does it mean when you say blackness? um, Representation, colorism, love, and many other topics can look different to different people and be interpreted differently from one discipline to another or one community to another. And to communicate clearly and have real discussion, we have to go beyond saying the words to unpacking the words. And our topic for today brings us back to that same space. Our topic is Black love. And there are a whole number of possible ways to think about, apply, and assume what we mean when we say Black love. It is also possible that we can never talk about the whole, but just address the pieces. So in starting to talk about Black love, I'm going to start by talking about what I mean and which parts I'm addressing. Black love can just be an acceptance of Blackness, or more likely embracing Blackness and understanding that it is beautiful, valuable, or precious. This can range the gamut from Black bodies, identities, culture, and cultural production. In this case, I'm focusing on Black love as a term bestowed on the relationship between two Black people who fall in love and want to share part or the rest of their lives together. Hashtag Black love. This description is not given to all relationships. The expectation is that Black love is a healthy, mutual relationship, and the label is given affectionately. In either case, whether romantic, between friends, family, or all Black people, I see Black love as an affirmation that is an expression of resistance to anti-blackness. All people love and desire affection. However, there's both a lack of representation of Black love and a distortion of Black love in popular media. That absence or misrepresentation promotes distortion, erasure, and invisibility of Blackness and Black affection. More specifically, the need to point out, Black love is a direct response to anti-Blackness that is commonly portrayed in television, movies, and other media in which there has been resistance to create deep, meaningful relationships between Black people for several reasons, including ideas about Black humanity, beauty, Black stereotypes, the white gaze, and colorism. In this continuation, or the first part of this is a continuation of an attack on Black humanity, as there's a resistance to showing the subtleness or complexity of Black people as humans who love. Black people have been historically portrayed through stereotypes and one-dimensional caricatures. Early representations are overt, monstrous, childlike, animalistic, lazy, minstrel-like images used to justify slavery and oppressive treatment. But some of that has evolved and has been passed through Blaxploitation to current token characters whose existence is to support white lead characters to fulfill their destinies and desires. These include extensions of the mammy, the magical Negro, or the Black best friend, often doubling as comedy relief. These representations leave little space for sensitive representations that have further depth or development, much less love. As a result, Black people are not presented as fully human. This type of otherness is not far from beliefs that white people have had that have questioned whether Black people cry or feel the same level of pain as white people. In a quote from Lisa Wade in When Whiteness is the Standard of Beauty, she says, non-white people are still allowed to be considered beautiful, of course, as long as they look like white people. Parallel to the resistance to feature Black love is the anti-Black paradigm of centering whiteness as the standard of beauty. Narratives of romantic love are often involve sexual attraction, affection, and human vulnerability. Whether it is based on appearance or beyond physical features, beauty is an integral part of these. Black people have had to combat these notions of beauty and reaffirm that Black is beautiful, understanding that consuming images from popular culture has consistently marginalized it. This affirmation, as well as Black love, are counter narratives to these anti-Black ideals, which not only are pervasive, but also internalized by Black people. Many of the visualizations of Black men and Black women are focused on interracial relationships in movies as well. And this only fuels the real and projected idea of Black men's desire for white women. Lastly, colorism in media in media further complicates issues, as light-skinned women's proximity to whiteness often places them as the default representation of Black love interests, which is rooted in anti-Black notions about beauty and who is worthy to be loved. As a result, dark-skinned Black women are rarely paired with lighter-skinned Black men, but light, almost white women are and have been common. Even within the Black community and among Black creators, hip hop and often unabashedly glorifies light-skinned women. There's also the idea that pairing a Black and white lead will make films more marketable, assuming that white audiences will not be able to relate to or palette a primarily Black cast or Black leads. For instance, even our first Disney princess represented in The Princess and the Frog has a white prince. Other films like The Bodyguard, Save the Last Dance, shows like Scandal, Something New, Bridgerton, Guess Who. I often in seeing these films, I often ask myself, could this story have not been told with a Black love interest? Or could this story have not been told with a dark-skinned Black love interest? And many of these films miss that opportunity. So I see the affinity and the identification of Black love as a direct response to that resistance. It elevates something that is then valued among Black people who see two beautiful, unambiguously Black people together in a healthy mutual relationship as something rare, worthy of celebration, and needed to be seen. We want to protect it and document it. It's like a unicorn, and it is part reality, part idealized fantasy, and part aspiration. Now, there are those moments that get it right and that at least break boundaries. There are a ton of them that that could be named. A few are Mahogany, Love Jones, Moonlight, The Photograph, or even Black Panther. Black love is seeing something deep in others because you love all of them and can relate to their Black body and experiences because you share that as common ground. Jill Scott sings, way back when we spoke Kiswahili, it was you and me. See, remember playing hide and go freak? I was the one you were born to seek, and I'm still here. Do you remember me? Jill Scott asked, don't you remember me? You and me, and me and you, and me? We built sand castles in the Serengeti. Don't you remember me? You splashed my face with Nile water. The daughter of the diaspora. You named me, claim me. I watched 2 sessions of the Black Love Summit. One session was the husband session, and the other was the wives session. In the almost 2 hours of the conversation, I only remember the word Black used one time. Other than that, there was no direct discussion of Blackness. However, there were inherent differences in the ways that they expressed their ideas and the points of emphasis. And the points of emphasis reflect the values that came from a Black experience. Additionally, just the image of Black people showing that type of tenderness, joy, and struggle to work through their relationships was impactful. It was beautiful. I felt connected with them. And this is one of the reasons why representation through images, language, cultural choices are important. It becomes an affirmation where I can look at them and say, I can have that, or I understand where they're coming from. I should note that the series reinforces traditional heterosexual male to female couples and marriage as the ideal for what it means to have Black love. It also centers couples that have gained a level of wealth and success. In that way, it is a thin slice of what Black love can be. For me, it is undeniable that we should talk about Black love and that it is valuable. It is resistance, it is representation. It allows us a way to get our ideas and perspectives and ways that we see across in ways that resonate with us. And in that way, it's precious. But another question that comes to mind for me, is it problematic to celebrate love specifically between Black partners in a way that elevates, idealizes, or centers love based on racial identification? I'm not talking about representation here. There's an obvious lack of representation that is connected with anti-Black sentiments. And there's a need to encourage greater representation, inclusion through film and other media. My question is, when we put Black love on a pedestal, are we marginalizing interracial relationships within our community and in some cases reinforcing colorism? For this, I have no answer. And I'm interested in what other people think about that as well.
All right. So I'm going to jump in now. I need to reshare the PowerPoint. Give a second for that to load. So again, I'm going to be talking about what we think about when we or how we should think about, maybe ask some questions about how we should think about the idea of love when it's modified by this term Black. So when we think of Black love, a seminal figure comes to mind, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His hagiographic image has become less of the prophet who warns of reckoning and demise, and more a purveyor of love. In this handwritten note on the top left of the screen, he wrote, "Love is the greatest force in the universe. It is the heartbeat of the moral cosmos." Indeed, we remember his 1957 sermon, Loving Your Enemies, as inspiration for radical love, where he said, "When the opportunity presents itself for you to defeat your enemy, that is the time which you must not do it." I want to return later to this notion of the enemy, but it's worth pausing a moment to consider British feminist writer Sarah Ahmed's critique of love as a kind of distortion which often functions to further stabilize already existing violence. If love functions as a means of boundary maintenance, and indeed it does do this work, you are family because I love you, you are friend because I love you, you are fellow citizen because I love the nation we constitute, then it's paradoxically inclusive and exclusive. And if, as Ahmed argues, we love the nation, which unfortunately historically has been constituted as white, or worse yet, we love this modern genre of humanity, which is fundamentally anti-Black, then this idea of love may only drive us toward whiteness. At least this seems the necessary outcome of refusing to take the opportunity to defeat the enemy. Whiteness becomes redeemable by way of love offered from Black people, with no guarantee of reciprocity, only an odd faith in the rehabilitation of whiteness, which throughout history has fixed itself as the apex of humanity and thus immune to notions of rehabilitation. What Dr. King yearned for was mutual recognition, and this is a lot of what people wrote on the whiteboard actually. That Black people might transcend race as if it were merely a category of social difference rather than a violent construction and a metaphysical holocaust. This language of metaphysical holocaust I borrowed from Frank Wilderson, who notes that peoples of Africa entered the slave trade, but they didn't emerge as peoples of Africa. They emerged on the other side of that historical process as Black. Their previous existence was denied, and this is not to argue that they lost all their language, culture, or habits of mind, but that they were denied any ground on which to define themselves as anything other than Black, a term now wrought with all sorts of negative signs, but reducible to biology. The Black was a body, it was fungible, exploitable, and sexual. So where Dr. King seeks mutual recognition, where Black people see white people's humanity and white people see Black people's humanity, he indicates what Frantz Fanon might have diagnosed as a psychosocial failure. This is no surprise, given the debt Dr. King's thinking owed to Hegel and his notion of dialectical unity. Therein, the master-slave dialectic offers a synthesis where the master's consciousness is intimately connected to the recognition of the slave. But as Frantz Fanon argued, white people were not seeking recognition from Black folks. They were seeking work, labor, bodies. There is no capacity then in that relationship, which Wilderson would call a non-relation, to invert this power dynamic. As Fanon put it, ontology, once it is finally admitted as leaving existence by the wayside, does not permit us to understand the being of the Black man. For not only must the Black man be Black, he must be Black in relation to the white man. Some critics will take it on themselves to remind us that, this proposition has a converse. I say this is false. The Black man has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white man. Overnight, the Negro has been given two frames of reference within which he has had to place himself: his metaphysics, or less pretentiously, his customs, and the sources on which they were based were wiped out because they were in conflict with a civilization that he did not know and that imposed itself on him. The Black can love the white because the white is the ground of ontology for this world. It's what it means to be human. But loving the Black may be an impossible gesture, doomed for failure per Fanon, because the Black exists not as a matter of fact, but according to Calvin Warren, as being for another. Is it possible to love the Black? I leave this question dangling because much of what I've said so far has been a long layover. What I'm really concerned with is what this means for our encounter with this thing that we call love when it's modified by Black. But the point of the layover was not to define the limits of love, whatever they may be, but to contextualize it, to treat it somewhat differently than Dr. King does, not as a moral force that transcends history, but as a historical construct vulnerable to deconstruction. And here, Derrida's deconstructionism is useful precisely because it exposes love as a kind of authority or authorizing logic that should not be treated as a fact, but rather recognized as a symbol or a representation, perhaps of a utopia that remains unreal and perhaps unrealizable. In simpler terms, if love is an invention of history, it may not be real in the sense that we often take it to be real, but it may be a convenient distortion for the maintenance of exploitative relations. In the instance of Dr. King's politics of love, it seems to me that we are not necessarily distracted from actional politics. There are far too many images of nonviolent, direct action Black protesters being booked in jails, bitten by dogs, burned out of their homes and churches to undercount the civic manifestations of a politics of radical love. Yet, they may also signify a sacrifice of love for the self, a willing exposure of the Blackened body to pain and suffering in order to justify entry into the category of humanity, or more directly, into citizenship with its attendant rights as defined by the law. Thus, in Monroe County, North Carolina, local NAACP leader Robert F. Williams was removed from his position by the national organization in 1959 after he said, "We must be willing to kill if necessary. We cannot take these people who do injustice to the court. In the future, we are going to have to try and convict these people on the spot." And Williams, if you're familiar with his history, made these comments after a white man was no bail for the sexual assault of an 8 months pregnant Black woman. And the NAACP thought that Williams's rhetoric was too much. And this is what I'm getting at. The politics of love has historically required a kind of silent suffering from Black people. Not an absolute silence, but certainly a silencing by way of decorum. There are certain things that can be felt but can't be said. This is a denial of the self in pursuit of the love of an other, who does not even recognize the pursuer as an other or the pursuit as legitimate. This is anti-Blackness at the level of the psyche. It disallows what someone wrote on the whiteboard, kind of authenticity. Fanon would call it pathological, a persistent rejection of the truth about Blackness, that it is hated without reason, that it is without metaphysical ground, that it is without ontological resonance, that it cannot be included in a reciprocal love relationship with the human because it is precisely what the human, who is white, negates. The enemy that we seek to love, we find at the end of this, I think, isn't white people or individual white persons, but rather the enemy is anti-Blackness, which makes authentic love incapable, according to Fanon. Wishing for others what one postulates for oneself, when the postulation unites the permanent values of human reality, entails the mobilization of psychic drives, basically freed of unconscious conflicts. Those are Fanon's words. But unconscious conflicts define the historical situation of Blackness. We both desire to love being Black while despising having to be Black in the first place. Let's say that again. We both desire to love being Black, while at the same time, we despise having to be Black in the first place. It's not our choice. And so, as Toni Morrison lamented in The Bluest Eye, the best hiding place was love. Thus, the conversion from pristine sadism to fabricated hatred to fraudulent love. It was a small step to Shirley Temple. I learned much later to worship her, just as I learned to delight in cleanliness, knowing, even as I learned, that the change was adjustment without improvement. And in some ways, I imagine a great deal of critical race theorists would say that's precisely their critique of the civil rights movement, adjustment without improvement. Thus, Lewis Gordon asked, what is the impact of anti-Black racism on love where one seeks in the eye of one's lover and from the words that flow from one's lover's mouth a form of justification of one's existence. So I'm here then to raise some questions about love's meaning, questions that become askable when we critically consider what it entails to modify a sign, love, with an additional sign, black. And I'm going to ask a series of questions here that I was supposed to cut down, so I apologize to my co-presenters that I never got around to it. But I'm going to ask them. If love is the unconditional giving of self, as we discussed as a cohort, thinking about Stines' monologue, and anti-blackness is hostile to the emergence of a self unencumbered by anti-blackness, that is, anti-blackness is also a part of ourselves, then is there always a double gesture in Black love, a giving of oneself to another, but where the self is not really oneself, but a fractured self, what Du Bois calls two-ness? Do we love Blackness as a matter of fact, or do we love Blackness as an act of resistance, as an attempt to salvage from the anti-Black world that we are desirable, beautiful, capable, and enough to? Do we risk, as Saidiya Hartman worries, of inventing a romance by attempting to fill the gaps of history with the sign of love? And by the gaps of history, I mean the failure of history to explain or give meaning to the suffering of Black people. Does the narrative arc of love, the greatest force, the ultimate redeemer, the being of God, in the words of Dr. King, function as a kind of theodicy, where theodicy is the theological justification for suffering in a world with an omnipresent and all-loving God? Does love console us, distract us from recognizing teleology at work, a teleology that motivates a continuation on the path, right, to follow the arc of history, a path that we have noted is defined by Black suffering and silence? Does love keep us from seeing Robert Williams's words? In the future, we are going to have to try and convict these people on the spot as daring to dream, as Afrofuturism, as utopic, as love. So those are the questions I'll leave us with, and we're gonna put all of these into a PDF and drop them in the chat if people want to look back at them after Dr. Searles. But I will now hand over the mic to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ponton. Alrighty, so let me take control. Okay, so good afternoon again, everyone. Some of you, okay, give me 1 second. Is the screen showing for y'all or is it showing black?
I am seeing black.
You still seeing black? Now it's okay, so acting up on my end. Let me see. Maybe I can do, I'll have to do it that way. Alrighty. So some of you may have heard me say this on other platforms, but I've been holding space in my heart and in my work for Dr. Omotayo Joel Osho since I learned of their passing last fall. Dr. Tayo was one of my favorite colleagues, and 4 years ago, they gifted me a set of their self-recovery cards, which were inspired by the late Bell Hooks's Sisters of the Yam. And that's actually a picture of the brunch that we were at, and it was a whole group of us, but I didn't get permission from everybody to show their pictures, so I had to edited us out. But anyway, so one of the cards advises us to, quote, set aside time every day to cultivate and experience joy. It could be joy for 1 minute, it could be for 5 minutes, or even longer. It could be joy for yourself or joy for others. Intentional breathing is one way to cultivate and experience joy. And in one of their blog posts titled Building a Hope Practice, Dr. Tayo reminds us of the importance of safe breath and says, our current moment is calling for a safe breath. We need to cultivate spaces and times to practice safe breath, to take a breath and breathe deeply. And so I'd like for us to take heed to Dr. Tayo's words, and if it is safe for you to do so, I'd like for you to join me in taking a moment to cultivate joy by practicing a short intentional breathing exercise. And so I'm going to turn my camera off and leave my microphone on and with the timer, and after the timer goes off, I'll get back to the presentation. Thank you all for joining me in that shared moment of cultivating joy. So, according to Bell Hooks, definitions are vital starting points for the imagination. What we cannot imagine cannot come into being. As we move toward our desired destination, we chart the journey, creating a map. We need a map to guide us on our journey to love, starting with the place where we know what we mean when we speak of love. For her, or for Hooks, her starting definition of love comes from M. Scott Peck's The Road Less Traveled. And I actually saw this definition in the chat earlier from Dr. Patterson. But Peck defines love as, quote, the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. We choose to love. This definition echoes others who maintain that love is a verb, an action. Choosing to love, whether in service to oneself or in service to others, implies that love requires some work, and not necessarily work as it's associated within a capitalist enterprise, but work as in doing the thing your soul must have, as womanist theologians would describe it. So with that in mind, and I hope this works, let's see. So with that in mind, I look to Black Futures Month as an appropriate destination in the journey to Black love. According to the Movement for Black Lives, Black Futures Month is a visionary, forward-looking spin on celebrations of Blackness in February. The Movement for Black Lives is using the time to celebrate our Black radical history and to imagine a world in which we are self-determined and free to dream, free to flourish, and free to be. So this is an excerpt from their clip. It's not the entire thing, maybe about 3 minutes of it.
Black magic, blackness, black happiness, blackness, yeah, everything, black chucks, everything, black hug, black love, everything.
Yeah, what are you listening to?
Flowers, why they so here, black roses, everything, black child,
It's old school. My grandma said it was her grandma's favorite.
Skin noir, Prince noir, here you are, black. Everything you need, better believe you are that. Skin noir, Prince noir, here you are, black. Everything you need, better believe you are.
Oh, shit. Freedom Summer.
Peace, child. I am your ancestor.
Yo.
Time has come and gone now.
Same.
And though you may not know of us, know that we loved you in advance. That we anticipated your brilliance. Broke what for your wealth. Spoke the liberation into being, into law, into land.
Child, if our work is not done, if you do not awaken every morning into Black power and Black love, then you must make your liberation whole. We are with you, and we know that you will win. Remember how we fought for you in the summer of 2020 and take back the power.
You were our man.
We have a mandate. We have a mandate. And damn it, we gonna do it. Call and response. Call and response. Call and response. Call and response. The mandate for Black people in this time. The mandate for Black people in this time. To avenge the suffering of our ancestors. To avenge the suffering of our ancestors. To earn the future generations.
In the clip we watched, the ancestors declared the 22nd century youth, "We loved you in advance. We anticipated your brilliance and broke what chains we could to build the world that you deserve. A world free of the brutal grind of capitalism. You are our wildest, freest dreams. We spoke your liberation into being, into law, into land. If our work is not done, you must make your liberation whole." For me, wholeness is being in healthy relationship with self, with others, and with the divine. That is a higher power, however one defines it. So, alrighty. I believe that epistemologies of the erotic that engage the breadth and depth of our senses can serve as guides on our way to a future where Black love is appreciated and more widely celebrated. According to Lamonda Horton-Stallings, because of the way senses have been ordered or colonized for commodification, African American writers and artists have understood how to develop necessary strategies for shifting signs and signifiers into touch, hue, tenor, tone, performance, and emotion. The invention of printing presses, museums, theaters, or record companies did not make such labor intuitive. Du Bois, Hurston, Nugent, Ellison, and other Black writers and artists attempt to configure a sensorium for a new humanity whose knowledge system would not require privileging one human sense over the others. And to me, this is where we can see an opportunity to be able to kind of reimagine Blackness. That is the title of our whole series, but it allows us an avenue to be able to reimagine Blackness so that we can have a future where we're just, free to be. So if Black love is a multisensory experience, what does Black love sound like? A caged bird singing, crashing waves against the shore, wind chimes dancing in the breeze? What does Black love taste like? the juice of a pomegranate seed, the sweet tart flavor of a pink lady apple, the decadent flavor of dark chocolate? What does Black love feel like? The swaying of hips to rhythms heard and unheard? A cool breeze on warm skin? What does Black love smell like? Shea or cocoa butter? Floral fragrances or warm, woodsy notes mixed with the sweat of the brow? What does Black love look like? Saint Soto and Gertie Brown's and Something Good's Negro Kiss? Coretta Scott King's tender embrace and loving kiss on the cheek of her beloved? Taraji P. Henson's warm embrace when Viola Davis won the 2015 Emmy for Best Actress? What kind of futures can we imagine if we think about Blackness through the lens or the language of love? If love is a multisensory experience, or for me, love is a multisensory experience that exists both within and outside of time. It gives us a prism by which we can see past, present, and future simultaneously. Epistemologies of the erotic, which encourage us to pay closer attention to our sensory knowledges, serve as useful guides on the journey to Black love. And these are just some of the questions that I thought about when I was thinking about, how can we engage the senses more, or the knowledge that our senses allows us on this journey towards Black love. So I am done, and we can take the rest of the opportunity to open it up to you all's comments and questions. And so we have this scheduled until 2:30. So if you can stay with us, we encourage you to continue to stay with us. Okay, let me stop sharing.
All right, and yeah, so we have a good deal of time left to just chat together and to think about these terms that we've been wrestling with, to think about their relationship and with the broader theme of reimagining Blackness. So feel free to drop questions or comments in the chat. Feel free to raise your hand. We love to hear from you. But now is your chance to sort of help us think through a lot of the questions we've been wrestling with. And we have one hand up so far, and that is Jordan, I believe.
Hi again. So I just want to start off by saying first, like, I love y'all and I love this. Like, this is like, just to start off by saying like this, like, I love being in a group where the call to mobilize thinking in the moment is something we're trying to cultivate here. So I just really appreciate that we're cultivating a space, and I think of it as a kind of garden, and I think it should be considered a kind of garden, that we're kind of constructing a garden for us to be thinking together. So just as a start, I want to give y'all just applause and praise for coming together and creating the space for us to think. To start, I've been reading a lot of Césaire. So there's two quotes that I think perfectly align with a lot of what I want to say and how I want to respond to all of y'all and sort of generate more questions. But he has these two quotes where he says, I'm going to read them in English. But he has one, he says, make no mistake, I never show my hand unless at the millennium. I never show my hand unless at the great fear. And he says, the next line after that, he says, adjust yourself to me. I refuse to adjust myself to you. And what I want to say is, in the spirit of love, that I love you and I love all of these and I love what we're doing, but you can't know my love. My love resists definition, right? The way I think about it is it's being in the hold. We're in the slave ship, right? So we're all together, we're all confused, and we're all trying to think through this thing together. But I'm talking, and you kind of can't hear me. I might be talking in a different language. I might be singing a song you ain't heard before, but we're all sharing in this. But I don't think we're going to have a moment where we clarify each other, right? You get me? So I want to start off there before I start going through my notes and say that part of the way I think we have to work through this thinking together is allowing ourselves to be confused. And this is mostly a mobilization against this idea of defining our terms. I think at some sense, we're all really comfortable and uncomfortable with this idea of defining terms, because we all recognize that this desire for terms might itself already be a white desire. We might already be falling back into anti-blackness by this desire to have terms, but at the same time, we recognize, but we got to have a ground. We have to figure out how to talk to each other. And so, riffing on Dr. Searle's conception of this turn to the erotic, rather than conceiving it on ground, I want to conceive of it on grounds, right? That we're sharing in larger spaces that are ultimately plural rather than singular. And so when you have the technical difficulties we were having, I think that this conception of the sound being doubled, insofar that we are both constrained and freed by the space of being on teams, right? That it's the space that doubles us. And it was actually a trip that Professor Freeman had, where you were talking about this history of the stock character, and you were talking about this idea of being doubled, but you had a pair of praxis, and you almost said dabbled. And I like that better. I like it, this idea that instead of that, we are being confined by these stock characters, by the position of the mammy, by the position of the hypersexual male, right? That we dabble in these things. I play that part, right? And sometimes, and that's a mask I wear. Sometimes I play it, sometimes I put it away. But they're all a part of the mask that we come to this thing that we call blackness, right? That they're not impositions on our being, but they're things that we play, right? And I'm riffing on this because I'm ultimately really concerned with James Joyce, who I think is riffing on the minstrel, right? And I think a part of our concern, that's something that we've definitely seen, and I think that I see in your conception, Dr. Ponton, in this conception of this love as being historically grounded, right? That it's open to decay, and that in this deconstructionist sense, in this sort of Afro-pessimist, turn to the historical archive, that it might just be something which manages, authority, right? That it's not this thing that we could actually have a claim to, rather it's this thing that just regulates us. But I want to say that love is possible, that what a Black love can be and the way that it can conceptualize itself is as a refusal of all previous things, right? That rather than a modification of love, that Blackness is this thing that mobilizes the deteriorization of love as a concept. So instead of it being this authority thing, the structure of authority, that Blackness has the potentiality to remove that completely through this work of abolition, right? Through this work of completely degenerating its structures and creating something else out of it. There's a lot more I could go on, but I just wanted to end by saying that, I love y'all again, right? That part of this work has to be confused. It has to be modeled. It has to be the sharing in the abyss. And part of my being willing to open up and talk in this forum is this willingness to be wrong and to be corrected. Because I'm a student. I mean, I should be corrected. I should be. That's the way I entered into the space, right? So I just want to say that I love and appreciate that y'all are letting someone like me and other students and other faculty come to this space and speak their minds on these very difficult questions. And I have more here that I'll probably pop back in and say something, but I'll just leave it at that and say, peace and love forever and for everyone.
Do either of you have any comments in response?
I have a couple of comments. Jordan, I'm really interested. Thank you for coming, and thank all of y'all for coming, and thank you for sharing your thoughts. But I'm really interested in what you said toward the beginning of your comments about how you love us, but we can't know your love. And I guess you were speaking, of course, for you singularly, but that just made me think about how or if can we ever really know anybody else's love. But then it also made me think about a quote that I really wanted to use from Toni Morrison's Paradise, which when researching for this, I learned that she originally wanted to call Paradise War, but her editors overrode that and made it be Paradise instead. But anyway, there's this long quote, and if we have time, I'll pull it up and share it. But in the quote, she talks about love being like an act, of course, an action, but she's saying that it's not a gift, it's a diploma, which to me indicates, of course, you know, if we think about the K-12 system or even here at the higher ed system, the toil, the work, the effort that we put in to get the piece of paper at the end of the day, but the piece of paper itself being love. So it's kind of like going back to, I guess, what Bell Hooks was saying in terms of like love being a journey. It almost seems as though Morrison would say that it's a destination, but then your comment about not being able to know or, you know, kind of identify with other people's love is what made me think about what Morrison had to say, because someone has to confer the diploma upon someone, or someone has to confer, I would say, if we're going to say love is a diploma, someone has to confer the love onto the object. So that's just kind of the first thing that came to mind that I wanted to share.
I guess I just had one really small thing. You kind of talked about, you started off talking about the defining terms, and I would say that there's a difference between defining terms and agreeing on terms, right? So so we all may have and I guess that's kind of what I was saying too, like we all may have very different perceptions of what something means, but I think to at least come to the conversation, we have to explain specifically what we mean, like so that we can kind of understand each other. And that doesn't mean, so for instance, even then I might have my version of Black love. We don't have to agree on that term, but to talk, to actually have a productive conversation, we have to kind of know what I mean and what you mean when you say it.
I see Jordan's hand up. If there's no one else who wants to jump in, I didn't see any other hands so far. Jordan, you can definitely feel free to unmute.
All right, yeah, because I want to keep riffing. You know, we're at a jazz quartet right now. Okay, we're all riffing. We're all doing our parts, and you know, to riff on that riff, you know, for me, it's that again in this. Maybe it's Fanonian in some sense. I don't know where it's coming from. I can't tell which ancestor is speaking through me. But it's kind of like, but nah, you don't get to know what I mean. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, I'm trying to think, there's like a quote that I'm very specifically trying to think about. It's Wilderson. He goes, you know, like when he's talking, he was being interviewed and he's talking about, you know, whether or not he means all this stuff literally about Black liberation, about killing white people. And he says, you know, that's for me to know and you to find out. You know, that part of this work of coming to the table, especially when it's an academic table, and I think it's when we have to flip, you know, in that very, you know, Jesus in the temple kind of way. We got to flip the table. That part of our terms can't be defined because they shouldn't be able to go through the kind of rigmarole of academic status of being agreeable or disagreeable. They kind of have to exist, and we have to act in a certain kind of way. And I think that's the call to the erotic. We have to act in a way that already expands the space that we're trying to initiate. But in that same way, we have to talk about it through code. It can't be in a way that is this academic, systematic way. And so part of thinking about it through Dr. Searle's, you know, conception of the Black film, I was thinking of this rapper I really, really love who passed away, I think last year, Ras G, rest in peace, who talked a lot about being, and I'll put his name in the chat, but who talked a lot about being this idea of that his work was both engaged in being in the past, being in the present, and being in the future. That a part of the work of, I think, of being in the academic institution, but also being a part of like Moten's conception of being a part of the undercommons, is taking the work that we're doing now, but realizing that is totally tied to the work of the past and already predicting the work of the future. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that. I think part of it can't be, you know, it has to be in this way that I don't want to say is coded, but part of it, because I don't like the language of code switching, I'm gonna be honest. But I like that idea that part of what I think you don't get to know. You have to find out what I think. But yeah, that's all I got.
Yeah, I don't know. There are a lot of assumptions there. I mean, I think that it it depends on what your goals are. I think there's a difference when you have a when you're doing it for a strategic purpose, right? And that may not necessarily be to communicate, or at least to, maybe it's to send a message, right? But that may not necessarily be to communicate what you think, or to have a particular sort of open conversation, right? Like I'm thinking about, I mean, there are many cases, but I'm thinking about like Carol Walker, her work, especially when it came out. I think part of the reason her work was powerful was because I think it was very difficult for people to grasp whether or not she honestly felt the way she did about the images. There was a lot of sort of ambiguity around that intentionally, right? Um, so in that case, like defining it would have relieved people, and said, "Oh, well, now I know what that is, so I can stop this conversation," right? But in this case, I mean, but in other cases, if you're working with other people in partnership, or if you're trying to gain a better understanding of where two people stand, then having terms that have a complete level of slippage doesn't allow for, that doesn't allow for any particular type of progress, right? You don't even know where, even if you think you are, you don't necessarily know where you're getting, right?
Yeah, I think that speaks back to this notion of love being a diploma. It requires a significant amount of work for understanding where someone else is coming from, but it also requires a significant amount of work on the person who wants to be understood to relate and communicate those ideas. Um, a lot of what we talked about leading up to this were representations of Black people in love in media. I think we talked about Living Single a little bit, where we see examples of friendship love and romantic love. One of the more popular representations of love being, most recently, being Insecure, which for a lot of people was really a love story about Molly and Issa, as opposed to their romantic entanglements with the men they were involved with. Um, but in all of those stories that we see, right, the conflict always revolves around a sort of misunderstanding of the terms on which the relationship is grounded. And I think this is reflected in the kinds of stories Black people have learned to tell about the kinds of love we feel. And those stories don't always feel good. They don't always feel like great stories. They don't always make us happy. But they're necessary stories. Um, and so we do the work in defining terms, in part because, right, it provides an entryway into not just what I know, but what I feel, which is what I also think animated us to ask the first question in the way that we did. What does love feel like? Because it's one thing to say this is what love is, and we would all have, right, a variety of definitions, but there was a sort of like a convergence of the way that love feels, a sense of security, a sense of belonging, a sense of being seen, a sense of authenticity. And those things defy what language can do. There's only so much we can say, but we can empathize and we can feel, right, through this intersubjective relationship what other folks might want to feel when they mention the word love. um, one of the other things that we talked about, and I might be shifting gears a little bit, but it came up for some reason while I was listening to you all speak. We had a brief conversation about Good Times, the sitcom, and sort of the backstory about how the first season of that show came about. Originally, Esther Roll's character, Florida, was supposed to be a widow. Her husband was supposed to have died before the series started, and she refused to allow the show to go forward with that story, because up until then there had not been any representation of, right, this Black man and Black woman who were married and raising their healthy family together. And so we got, for the first time, this representation on television. And there's something incredibly beautiful about Good Times. And I'm going to leave out the minstrelsy that's in it for now. Although, as you mentioned, right, it may not be an imposition as much as it is a dabbling in. I don't know if I buy that, but I wrote it down. But if we put that to the side for a second and think about what was Esther Wool attempting to do in this moment. She's attempting to say, all of the representations that y'all offer us of Black families and what Black love looks like, they ain't accurate. We do have families that are built in a certain kind of way that looks traditionally nuclear. And there's a double gesture there, right? When we think about what that means for Black love. On the one hand, that representation is important because Black families are stigmatized for not being, right, held together in a traditional nuclear fashion. At the same time, there's this reinforcing of the idea that this is a proper representation of what a Black family should look like, that this is the normative Black love. So what she did was historically important, right, for representation in media. At the same time, right, she couldn't help but to reinforce a certain image of what it means. And this gets back to Fanon. We recognize that we are Black, but we are reminded constantly that we are the Negro. And part of what she's doing here is saying, like, look, Black love can look like this. And at the same time, right, in a double gesture saying, and we are not Negroes, right? We are not the kind of people who you imagine as dysfunctional, as not being able to have families that look this way or relationships that are healthy in this way. And that for me is the complexity of a term like Black love, and part of why perhaps we need to come not necessarily with definitions that we agree on, but with questions that allow us to critically engage these terms. I imagine that's your hand up, Jordan. Go ahead.
I didn't want to keep using the raise your hand function. No, but yeah, I think it was funny. The term you used, I think both of you used, was slippage, and it's funny because I have a term in French that it's this love letter to Edward Glissant, because glissant in French just means slip. So I call it glissentiments, right? So this glissentiment is this Freudian slip. It's this changing of language. It's this flowing through these channels of thought that pushes us in different directions. That's what I think Blackness is, you know, well, maybe not what it is, but I think that's one of the way I want to put it, that's one of the tricks we have at hand, right? One of the tricks we have at hand is we can just move. we can go from talking this academic talk to talking about Tupac and talking about how his Black consciousness in something like All Eyes on Me is a critical part of what it means of cultivating Black consciousness, right? That for me, it's this willingness to not ground ourselves in any way. The way Glissant talks about it is being circular nomads, right? Is that the movement of the colonized civilization is the arrowhead, right? It's we're going to go, destroy, take, and keep moving forward, right? But that what the circular nomad does is they cultivate, they listen, they move, they find, they scavenge, they're in community, they're in relation, and they come back, right? And it's this something that is generated by a larger cycle, a larger notion of time than just the day or the month or the minute, right? So like that's for me the kind of move I want to make is like, well, let's kind of be Creole, right? Let's mobilize creolization. And so part of it for me is that's why I'm so focused on the minstrel and on this dabbling, is because a part of it is saying is, you know, Glissant says in his Caribbean discourses, he's like, well, yeah, this structure of creolization is the same structure of the minstrel. Right, it's the same structure, this structure of this sort of yes, sir, yes, ma'am, right? That same linguistic structure, they're really close, right? Now, he doesn't get as close on the linguistic structure as I would like, but he at least recognizes that there's a similarity, right? And so I think part of what I've been trying to do in my poetry is in listening to Paul Laurence Dunbar, who I adore, right? But I think it's really troubled because he gets that the only thing people want to hear from him is his slave dialect poems, but he loves him some Tennyson. You know, he loves doing this really romantic poetry. And so you've had this really weird moment in poetic study, you know, in studying his work where it's like, okay, people like Maya Angelou take his, you know, his pure poetry. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, right? And a lot of people, you know, he was really popular at the time when because he's doing these dialect poems, and people loved hearing these dialect poems because they're weird. You know, you're reading them, it's like, yeah, this is English, but it's also not English. There's something weird happening here. And it's weird. We don't know how he felt about them. But part of what I want to mobilize in his work is seeing this use of dialect as it's a version of the English language, as something which destroys these normative relations of what it means to use English and create something out of it. And I think it's this grounds that allows us to see what Fanon was calling Black neurosis, so that it gives us a way to analyze it, right? Because that's one of the things, and I'll end with this, is that I think that's one of the things that Fanon doesn't really get when he starts tackling Black literature. By Black, I mean African-American literature. Like, he goes to Wright and he's like, the only thing Wright's really good at is getting a psychological picture of the Black man. It's like, no. Fanon, like Wright's doing something incredible. Like, I know Baldwin and Ellison move away from him, but I think Wright grounds the Black novel, period. I really think he does. So for me, it's being able to mobilize this rejection of English, of English literature, to be able to flourish something else. But again, keeping Fanon's critique of like, yeah, but what we're in is neurosis. We have to be able to strategize and understand what it is we're doing, and that we're trying to get to a new humanism. We're not trying to stay here. We're trying to move on. But that's all I got.
I want to switch gears real quick and go to one of the questions that Dr. Ponton had at the end of your part. I was trying to download the PDF, but I couldn't do it, but I took a picture of it. So let me see if I can read it. The one that I'm really interested in is, I think the first one that talked about, is it a double gesture? So even though we didn't go into the Stines monologue, for those of you who are still here, that if you've heard the Carters' Black Effect song, and they have the woman at the beginning of it who talks about what she thinks love is, that's Dr. Stines. But that question, I think, is something that I'm interested in us thinking through, unless other people had other questions that y'all wanted to discuss. Let me know. But this one says, if love is the unconditional giving of self, as quoted in the Stines monologue, and anti-blackness is hostile to the emergence of a self unencumbered by anti-blackness, that is, anti-blackness is also a part of ourselves, then is there always a double gesture in Black love? And that question kind of makes me think about what it is that you all have been talking about, you know, with Jordan's musings. So can we spend a little bit of time thinking about that one? Thank you for pulling it up.
Yeah, it made my computer go haywire for a second, so I lost whatever you said in the past 30 seconds. Sorry.
I just read the question and asked if you could spend some time thinking about that one, because that was the one that really intrigued, or one of the ones that really intrigued me.
Yeah, I was actually thinking again about the double gesture while Jordan was speaking, and it was making me think of Professor Friedman's question about, like, you know, in defining or thinking of Black love in a certain kind of way, do we leave out the folks in our communities who are in relationships with non-Black people? And right there's a sort of another paradox or an impossibility there, right? To lay claim to the importance and the essentialness of Blackness requires on a very important level, right? An exclusion of the consideration of these other things. And it's not to say that they don't matter, it's just to say that they don't matter for this. For people who have this very particular and unique history and relationship to humanity, to always have to consider ourselves as part of the grand human story as opposed to an opposition to the grand human story, means that we're always sort of drawn back into a multicultural discourse, one that once again causes us to think through this Du Boisian double consciousness, this irreconcilable two-ness, where we can't say, you know what, anti-blackness is foundational in this world, and it really matters that we understand what it means to be Black to the exclusion of anybody else's considerations. While at the same time, like holding on to the humanist compulsion to say, but we're all the same, and we should include everyone because that's the way to get out of this, right? That for me is that humanist love that drives us toward, right, a certain destination, this moral arc of the universe, and one that I don't really buy into because that's not what history shows me, right? History shows me that Black people have had to make do with love in a way that is different from the ways that white people have learned to exploit the definition of love that has been provided. And so that's my first comment. But I thought, you know, it really did bring me back to this question about, you know, exclusion versus inclusion, and perhaps as I mentioned earlier in the talk, right, love is paradoxical in that way, and that it requires some sort of exclusion, but why can't it be love, right? Why can't Black people say, you know what, this is for us, and that's love? And in part, it's love because we have defined it as being just for us in a world that says we don't deserve to have anything.
I love that. I want to say, and this is just going to be real quick, to your point, David, that you brought up about MacArthur's question, it made me about like how do we factor into how do interracial relationships or marriages factor into the conversation? It's not the same, but in that same novel Paradise that I was talking about earlier, that long quote comes from, the inverse almost happens. I think the name of the city is Ruby, and in Ruby, it's taking place in, I think, 1970s Ohio, of course fictitious, but in that particular city, people who are light-skinned are the ones that are like discriminated against, and you know, 2 light-skinned women even die because they don't have like anyone who's willing to give them medical attention. And so it's kind of like, you know, the darker you are, the more pure your looks are thought to be. And for me, that part just is where I guess I struggle a little bit with. I know we've talked about this in our own kind of cohort meetings, where, you know, some people will say, especially like radical Black thinkers would say that you can't be committed to the cause, or, you know, you're not one for Black love if you aren't married to a spouse or you don't have a partner who's also Black. So they automatically equate, you know, because we know marriage is an institution, or being who you decide to partner with is an institution. It can be made to be a political choice. Love can't stand for love by itself when it comes to how, or the ways in which we interact with other institutions in the world, such like government and, you know, all of those things. So I don't know if I have an answer that I've settled on personally. To me, I think that's where I draw the line, and I'm like, people can just be with whomever they want to be with. Life is short. Love who you want to love. But I don't know that I'll go as far as to say that someone, you know, who is very Black centered in terms of ideological, that if they decided to partner with someone who isn't Black, I don't know that I would be willing to question their love or affinity to Black people just because of who they decide to be involved with, you know? So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this is to me, this is never a hard question, because these are 2 different things happening, right? It's talking about someone's personal love relationship is a different kind of analysis than the structural one that deals with this thing that we've been calling and trying to figure out, that is blackness. That is, we started off with, right, a general sort of what does love feel like, and then what comes to mind when you think of black love, and then we thought about what happens when you modify either of these terms with the other one. What does love become in the context of Black history? That has very little to do with individual Black people's relationships, and everything to do with the non-relation between Blackness and humanity. What happens when you modify Black by love? It, again, has very little to do with the interpersonal individual relationships between Black people, and a lot more to do with the kinds of futures we can imagine, through a language or a discourse of love that is centered on redeeming Blackness, which is thought to be irredeemable given its historical origins. And so what people do in their individual lives, like, I'm really unconcerned with that. It doesn't tell me anything really about, your love for Black people or your commitment to a Black future. So that's it. That's what I wanted to say. Easy. That question for me, it never keeps me up at night.
Yeah, in some ways I asked that question, but I'm also not quite sure. I'm not quite sure of the impact of it or the importance of it. I'll put it that way. And the question was really was not about it wasn't really about trying to have some type of stance on interracial relationships or something like that, or saying it should only be one or the other, or you can't go outside of it. It wasn't something like that. It was more about whether or not we should idealize Black love, and what effect that has, right? Which in this case, it's not like I see someone screaming from the top, like, don't idealize Black love. But I think it is a question, right? It is a question. And because it's almost like I was really framing mine around like hashtag Black love, like seeing something and saying like, that's Black love right there, right? And that's what we want. But in the extension of that is that's what we want to see. That's what we want to see, which can translate into other things. We don't have a problem with interracial relationships being like shown. And there's plenty of it in comparison to relationships between Black people on and especially even dark skinned Black people on television. So that's why I don't see it as a problem, but maybe a question.
And I think that gender complicates it too, y'all, because, you know, as a Black woman, especially growing up in the 90s and hearing older Black women or even like my peers comment on famous people, or not, maybe not even famous people, just affluent Black men who we would consider to be eligible partners, but to be partnered with white women, that was a problem. So I think that a problem because of what society tells us, like, you're not. So you're not fill in the blank enough. You know what I mean? So I think that, personally, I don't think that way, but I do think that those images and those narratives that maybe not as much now, maybe more so like, during my upbringing were more prevalent, but I do think that those are worth thinking about in terms of maybe not the individual interpersonal instances of it, but I do think that they have larger kind of structural or kind of societal implications. So.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the representation totally matters. That is not gone away at all. We have increased representation of Black love, but it's not, kind of like that video that we watched. It's not enough. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think you're right to point out, right, if we're looking at it from, like, if we're, let's say we're sociologists, Right? If we're looking at it from a structural level, and if we're looking at it in terms of marriage being a market, it is an economic exchange. And when we think about the history of Black men who have been able to rise to affluence, that makes them more marketable to a wider array of women. And I should probably say in a double gesture slippage, a whiter array of women. Right, and so they become marriageable in that sense, right? So race and gender play a significant role there, and when that starts to become a pattern that we see, it does signal certain messages, especially to young Black girls and to Black boys who learn to perhaps aspire to a certain kind of marriage, and then at the same time, it is interesting that that is the image that we have of affluent Black men, because the majority of affluent Black men remain married to Black women. So there is also something to be said about why those images become so prevalent and why they carry so much cachet in our society. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say on that. But we are at 2:32. So if there are any closing remarks, I'll turn off my mic. Any closing thoughts from Professor Friedman or Dr. Searles or Jordan?
I just want to thank everybody for coming, those who were able to stay and those who had to leave.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for a great conversation. Looking forward to the next one.
All right,
Peace
thanks.
and love. Peace and love. Peace and love. Peace and love.